And for more on this contentious issue of American property claims in Cuba, I'm joined by Peter Hakim. He's the President Emeritus and Senior Fellow at the Inter-American Dialogue here in Washington. Peter, thanks for joining us. Good to see you.
It's a pleasure, really.
A very contentious issue. After the revolution, U.S. property owners registered claims for about $1.8 billion. Some people have valued that at least $8 billion now, maybe $14 billion. And of course, if Cuba takes off and the economy recovers, well, then who knows how much these properties could be worth. Where do things stand with resolving this?
Well, they really stand nowhere. In other words, the people left Cuba for the most part, and their properties are in Cuba. They've been taken over by the state in the greatest share. I mean, most of this was companies, and then a small amount were private homes, about 15%. But there's been no payment made at all. And these are claims, of course, the figures you just cited are all determined by U.S. commissions and U.S. courts. So there's no indication that Cuba agrees with this. There's been no real negotiation over this.
So nothing has been mentioned in all of this talk of restoring diplomatic relations. Has there been any dialogue between the U.S. and Cuba about this so far?
Not that I know of in any serious way.
Well, this could be very contentious because Cuba hasn't really admitted to having taken anything in past cases that we've seen with companies trying to get back property.
Well, the fact is Cuba did admit that it took, and in fact it guaranteed some form of payment in bonds at one point. But right now, 50 years later, this becomes intensely complicated. On one hand, you have the issue of justice. I mean, is it fair for someone who's come to the United States, made a lot of money here, or middle class or upper middle class, and going back and claiming property that's now in the hands of very poor Cubans? That's just an issue.
But the government should...
Secondly, is the question of the legal issues involved, which you're mainly talking about so far. And third is very practical. Cuba doesn't have that kind of money to reimburse. In other places, in the case of Europe, for example, where some repayments were made, they were pennies on the dollar, that the Europeans thought that a diplomatic relationship was more important than recovering the money in some form or another from the Cubans. So this is very, very complicated.
It's very complicated, Peter. And one of the complicated issues is also, how do you validate these claims? I mean, who's to stop every Cuban in Miami saying, hey, my uncle, my grandfather had a sugar farm, had a plantation, and I'm owed this? What would be the process of proving that you are legitimately
I think it'll be
a
easier
claimant?
in terms of the large businesses, which make up about 85%. There'll be deeds, there'll be... The question, of course, is how people got that land in the first place. Cuban governments over the years haven't been exactly the most honest, the most transparent in their transactions.
Right.
So one has to really sort of worry. I think in the end, this is a negotiation, a diplomatic outcome. It's not going to be based on sort of these kinds of facts we're talking about. They're going to be talked about practical realities, how much each side wants the relationship, the capacity to pay, in what form payment is made. It won't be sort of a very easy, it'll be, like I say, negotiated.
Negotiated, but it's very critical for Cuba to get this negotiated, because if Cuba wants to open up its economy, why would any company want to invest in Cuba and buy land or build something on land that it may or may not have legal right to, or that may be nationalized? So surely this would impact foreign direct investment.
Why would anyone want to lend money to Argentina, which is defaulted on its debt? Why are people continuing to lend money to Puerto Rico, which is now in default on its debt? It's because people think of the future, not necessarily
Well, you mentioned debt, and that's a valid point, because there's talk that Cuba will issue some form of government bond to compensate people for this. But like Argentina's government debt, is that worth anything? Do you think that would be acceptable?
Well, or like, you know, you have countries that go into default. You have businesses that go bankrupt. People who are investors look to the future. The past is one guide to the future, but not the only guide.
All right, well, we'll leave it on that futuristic note. We're out of time. Thank you so much, Peter Hakim, President Emeritus and Senior Fellow at the Inter-American Dialogue here in Washington, D.C.